Hi, I'm Richard Eastman. I was transportation chairman on 5 floats, starting in 1957 through 1962, which included, which came first, the Chicken or the Egg, and St. George and the Dragon, both of which were theme prize winners, all the way through Man and the Moon.
Could you tell us what the transportation chairman is? Because we do not have that position anymore.
Well, is not the right word. Was. and I'm not sure what it was. Actually, the transportation chairman was the person challenged with planning the route for moving the float from the barn, or the building place where we built the float on campus, over to Pasadena, which initially was in the car barn, and then later over to Oakmont, as I recall. That role included having to coordinate, plan the route, validate the route, coordinate all the security officers and security transportation of the folks that get all the permits from the county for wide load and all of that kind of stuff.
And you also got to drive the float, right?
Well, yes. The real thing for me was to drive the float. Yes, I enjoyed then and I enjoy now driving. And driving the float was a major role for the transportation chairman.
Very nice. So let's talk about each of the floats you worked on. Let's start with 1957, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Which came first, the chicken or the egg? That was the last float that they built on the Voorhees campus. And the Voorhees campus had a winding road, went down a steep hill, winding to get off the campus. They had built the float up on the top of the hill, and we had to go down the hill. And the transportation chairman that year was driving, and as they made the last turn at the bottom of the hill, he managed to get the float off the side of the edge of the road. And because of the length of the float and where the wheels were, all of a sudden he had no traction, and they couldn't get it back up onto the road. And so after 15 minutes of trying, and with the sheriff's police escort arriving, they decided to go get a tractor from up on campus, pull it off. And while they were gone, my role was to sit in the driver's seat and be in charge of the float. And I had, prior to that, had some experience working with vehicles that were off the road when I was in a volunteer fire department. And that experience I put to use and managed to get the float unstuck from where it was stuck and back on the road and ready to going down the road the right direction, ready to go down and meet the police escort that was at the bottom of the hill. And the result of that was that, and we got that all done before they got back with the tractor. And the end result was that from that year on, Henry House had me be chairman of the float, not the float, but chairman of the transportation for virtually the rest of all the time I was still in school.
And Henry House was your advisor, correct?
Henry House was our float advisor at that point in time, yes.
And you said that was the last year you were on the Voorhees campus. After that, you went to the Pomona campus, correct?
After that was the last year the float was built on the Voorhees campus. That may have been the reason that was the last year the float was built on the Voorhees campus. But yes, in the 4 succeeding years, the float was built on the Cal Poly campus down in the old, what was until I guess just recently, the float construction area. That's down behind the maintenance department.
It's
and the
still being
firehouse.
built there.
Is it still being built there?
Yeah, but we're getting a new building soon, it sounds like.
Yeah. Among other things, I lived and worked in that firehouse down there for a couple of years, so it was, home base for me for a long time.
Could you talk about the transition at all, how it was, like being easier not having a curvy road? Do you remember anything about that?
Yeah, I don't remember anything about that transition. I mean, one year we built it up in Voorhees, and the next year we were building it, and I got to remember I was a real neophyte freshman the year we built the first year when we built the chicken, which came first, the chicken or the egg. I was really green behind the ears. I'd only been in school about 3 months, and it was all, and when we moved to Voorhees, the building team were all kind of the same group of guys. Not some of them had graduated, but they were experienced builders. And as a sophomore, I just went. I helped with some of the building, but mostly in that era, transportation chairman job was particularly for a sophomore. It was a lot of work. We had to get permits. We had to get road permits, oversized vehicle road permits. We had to plan the route before we went to get the permit. Then we had to go and convince the city or various cities, not just one, but all the cities that we would go through, because in that time in history, they were all little cities that we were going through. There was not one big megalopolis like it is today. We were going from one city.
Bunch of little cities.
Yeah, we were going through one city after another city after another city, and every city had its own little unique rules about how oversized vehicles could go through the city and what hours they could go through the city and what roads they could take to go through the city. So it was, there was a fair amount of work involved. It wasn't just we're going to go and call the escort guys or the campus folks. I don't know how they do it today. I have no idea who gets those permits.
One of our advisors gets the permits, and then we get escorted by the Cal Poly police.
Yeah, well, right there. The advisor gets the permits. He's walking in the door with Cal Poly on his shoulders, so to speak. Okay, and I mean, how many years are we talking about now? From 1964.
This is our 70th year.
And so we were 9-10 years into that. So that was 60 years ago. Things have changed a lot in 60 years.
Oh yeah.
So.
So let's move on to 1958, Summer Daze. Do you remember any stories from that year? That was the octopus with
do I remember?
like a Little Mermaid scene.
Yeah, I remember, yes. Summer Daze. Summer Daze is a classic in my head. It was the first year I was the transportation chairman, full chairman. And we had a sheriff's escort officer, 2 of them. One in front, one behind. 2 sheriff's motorcycle cops escorting us. Going down along, I think it was Valley Boulevard. I'm not 100% sure that it was Valley, but one of those streets going east-west. We were going west. And I'm looking out in front, and of course we don't have all we just have the metal framing together. We haven't plastered it yet. And I look up and I can see this car coming at me, and it's not coming in a straight line, and he's not pulling over the side of the road. He's weaving all over the road. And he weaves right past the first sheriff's car. And of course the 2 motorcycle cops move over there to kind of escort this guy. And he weaves right across the front of the float, and then he drives off the side of the road on the right-hand side into the ditch. And of course, we all had to stop. The police officers had to do their thing. And it took us 15, 20 minutes before the other police folks got there, and we finally proceeded on ahead. And the police told us that the guy was driving under the influence. So 3, maybe 4 months later, Henry House, our advisor, and I believe it was the float chairman. I can't remember who that was now, but there were 3 of us, were asked by the police, requested by the courts to come down and be witnesses in this trial, because the guy, this person had pleaded innocent, driving under the influence. And so we're sitting in the courtroom, and the judge asks the guy who's been accused to tell him what happened. And the guy stands up and says, "Judge, I was driving down the road in just normal, ordinary way, and I looked up, and there was an octopus coming at me. And I dove into, I had to turn to the right to get out of the way of the octopus." And of course, all of the folks in the courtroom that are there, it was not just his case, but there were lots of people there because it was traffic court, and almost everybody breaks out in laughter. And of course, Mr. House puts his hand on both of our knees and says, "Steady, guys." And the judge kind of snickered and hit his mouth, and he finally looks up and he says, "An octopus?" "Yes, Your Honor, an octopus." "You know, Mr. So-and-so, I'm gonna have to find you guilty." And of course, they never got to us. That never ever became an issue. Although Summer Daze was in fact an octopus moving down Valley Boulevard. If the guy ever sees this film clip, he's going to go back and claim he was innocent.
Get the whole case cleared?
Get his
driver record
Get his
cleared,
whole driving record from 1958, I guess it would have been. Or December of '57, cleared. So, yeah, that was one of the highlights of.
Do you remember anything else that year? Like, I think there was bubbles going on that float. Do you remember how that was done?
I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't.
Let's move on to 1959 St. George and the Dragon. What do you remember about that year?
Mostly I remember that St. George and the Dragon won the theme prize. It was almost a normal year, as I recall. Nothing unusual happened. All the permits came through like they were supposed to come through. We won the theme prize. And my recollection is that the one thing I remember about that was still in a car barn. It was colder than, anyway, it was really cold.
And that float was a Jeep for what you were driving, right? Like half a Jeep. And the exhaust is what created the smoke effect, like someone sprayed oil into it?
Yeah, I think that, I vaguely recall that, but that would have been outside my domain of responsibility. I had to get the thing over there, I had to get the thing back, and then I had to get it down the parade route. But I vaguely recall that, yes, they used some
sort of oil
in the exhaust and I also vaguely recall that one of the people in the float got asphyxiated or not, but got sick because of that exhaust coming up and coming out. But again, I was in front of that. It was not my not my problem.
You had the wind helping you. It was just blowing backwards.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. How about 1960 Special Delivery?
That was the year.
Anything special happened that year?
That was first of all, that was Ron Simon's first year on the float, as I recall. And that was the year that we had the stork. And the stork was really tall. I want to say 14 or 15 feet up there. And planning the route for getting the stork from campus up to Pasadena was in itself a challenge, because you don't know how many streets in that era had telephone wires and electrical wires that were 12 to 13 feet above the street, and we had to detour to go around. It was an unusual drive to start with. The day before the night we moved, I drove that route, and I validated and checked all the heights because I knew we had this tall stork. And everything was copacetic. Everything was fit to go. And then we started the drive on the night of the ride. And everything went pretty much as planned right up till we started up Colorado Boulevard. And sometime between the time I had inspected that route and the time that the float got to that route, the city of Pasadena had hung bells across all across Colorado Boulevard. And not only did they hung the bells, they had looping wires that came down. And the trick was to get between the looping wire and the bells without hitting either one. And Ron Simons was on the front of the float trying to guide me. Oh, and that was the year. The other thing about that year is that particular year was the first year that, I think it was, we only used it for 2 years. We had an Air Force jet tug. And it was supposed to have arrived and arrived late. And so they built the float so that they could drive this tug in underneath and just clamp it on to the float.
Basically they left the middle of the chassis open, left a little gap in there.
In the back, and we drove it in from the back. Okay? And then they welded little round bars on the float, and then we clamped onto these round bars. Well, these bars slipped like this on these, the clamps slid back and forth on the float. Well, only not much, maybe about 2-3 inches, okay? But the float itself was on caster wheels, and the tug had 4-wheel directional drive. So as we would turn one direction, the tug would be going one direction, and the float would still be on the caster wheels going the other direction for maybe 1 or 2 seconds.
And that's because of the slack in
because of the slack in these things. So now we start up Colorado Boulevard with Ron Simons standing in the front, up by where the stork was, trying to guide me between the bells that were hanging up there and the wires that were looping down. And we just never got the timing right between when to turn the tug and the length of time it would take the tug to actually impact and start turning the float. And the result was we rang about half of the bells going up there. the big bells, the little bells, they'd loop around and they'd loop around, and sometimes I think we knocked off one, maybe two. We hit the big bells, we hit the small bells. The little small bells were on the side and the big bells were in the center. It was the darndest bell ringing experience you could ever imagine. It was, but to my knowledge, the city of Pasadena never came back to the university about it. So.
I was just about to ask that.
I have no idea what the city of Pasadena and how the university ever worked that out, or even if they did. I do remember ringing the bells.
They probably realized, oh wait, there was a float that was coming through this time. We had a
You know, I don't think the left hand knew what the right hand was doing.
Yeah.
More realistically.
All right. So is that all you'd like to say about special delivery?
That's all I remember. I only remember the highlights. That's all I particularly remember about it. Yeah, I think it was Slow Boat to China. That was the next year.
Yep, 1961.
Slow Boat to China had two incidents that come vividly to memory. The first one is Slow Boat to China had a big front end fender like this, and it was, of course, all of that steel with the steel wrapped, and there wasn't a whole lot of framing in the front of that particular year. It was just the steel bent, welded against the steel. That was the year that we had the sheriff's officer who came and said, you know, we're going to stop at all the signals. We're not going to barge our way through. We're just going to stop at all the signals. Now, keep in mind that was the second year that we had this tug. And I told the sheriff, the deputy sheriff that was heading the guys, I said, you know, I can't, the brakes on this tug don't work that way. Okay? I can't, if you stop, and I can't be sure I'm going to get stopped. So we're going to stop. We are going to stop at every signal we come to. And of course, we came to the first signal, Valley Boulevard. There was no traffic intersecting. Came to that first signal, and it was a red light. The sheriff stopped, just like he said he was going to. And I tried to stop the float, and I couldn't stop the float. And the float just wrapped that whole sheriff's car right up inside of it, and then it sprung him right across the intersection like that. And, you know, he never stopped at another red light the entire way, all the way up to Pasadena.
He learned his lesson.
Yeah, he learned his lesson. And I remember that's one of those vivid things. I remember kind of the eyes got just like this when in his rear view mirror as he was shooting across the intersection in a red light. And the other thing that happened in Slow Boat to China was Bob Pettis was riding in the float with me. He was the co-transportation chairman. We had a power generator.
And that was for like the music and things like that.
Yeah, electrical power generator, gas-driven power generator, 1960s variant. Not new 1960s either. Might have been even 1950s variant. And it drove the generator, which drove all the electric, and included the boat that rocked, and all the electricity in the float was driven by this one generator. And that generator sat right in front of Bob Pettis. Bob Pettis sat on my right, and he was up about 3 feet above me on my right. And that generator only had about an hour and a half fuel in it, which meant that we were going to have to refill the gasoline tank, the little gasoline tank in the generator, as we went down the parade route. So halfway down the parade route, we decided it's time to fill the generator. Bob picks up the can of gas he's got right here, and he opens up the lid, and I'm sitting down below him 2 or 3 feet. And one of the things about that thing is that that generator was sitting there. When we tested it at campus, we didn't have the flowers, it didn't have any of the covering on it. You know, it ventilated fine. When we were in the parade, the flowers and all that covering captured all the exhaust off of this thing. So Bob is not only sitting up there managing this thing, he's about half out of it just from fumes, exhaust fumes coming from this little one piston powered generator. He grabs the can of gasoline, opens the little slot on the top, takes the top off of this thing, and he pours the gasoline like this. And as he starts to pour, you can see the fumes coming out. And one thing neither one of us had given any thought to was the fact that that particular generator had a live open spark right in front of where he was pouring the fuel. And as soon as he started to pour it, I said, "Don't do that, Bob!" But he kept right on pouring. And as you see me sitting here today, that is probably the closest I've ever come to blowing myself up, was watching Bob Pettis pour live fuel and the vapors coming off that going into this little live spark driving the power generator. It was a real tense moment. So, and then the next one after that was
1962, Man on the Moon.
Man on the Moon.
And that was your last float, correct?
Man on the Moon was my last float. Man on the Moon, I got drafted. And Henry House by that time was no longer, he was still the float advisor, but he had moved up and was now also Vice President, Student Affairs, I believe was his title. And I got drafted. And I went to Henry and I said, "You know, Henry, I just got drafted. I'm not going to be able to drive the float this year." And Henry says, "Oh, what was your major when you started here?" And I said it was sales and marketing. He says, "You know, when we changed your major to marketing, we dropped one of your classes. So we're going to change it back to sales and marketing. And we're going to write the draft board and tell them they can't draft you now because the university made a mistake and we need to have you here for one more quarter." So Henry House enabled me to stay to be able to drive the float, actually to be transportation chairman for one last float. At that point I was a senior, and I'd done this a whole bunch of years. And I thought I understood real well how all of the parade went. And that particular year, Ron Simons was Man in the Moon. He was up front in the moon telling me how to drive the float. And it was pretty warm. And so I had been drinking a lot, not alcohol, but just getting a lot of fluids in. And Chuck Tanner was, as I recall, the co-driver that year. And Chuck enjoyed the girls. And one of the girls had said something about the fact that she was thirsty. And so when the parade stopped at one of these, it's intermittent stopping places, the parade in that particular year seemed to be stopping a lot more than usual, and as a result of it, it made a stop, parade stop. And Chuck made a run popped out of the float and ran over to a local Gedunk cart, got drinks and a couple of hamburgers and brought them back, and handed the drinks to the girls and brought me a hamburger. And then we sat and waited and eating the hamburger before the parade started to move again. And so now I've got more liquid on top of liquid, and all of a sudden I'm feeling this great need. I've got to go to the bathroom. And the parade stops. And I look out and I ask Simons, is the parade moving up in front? Word I get back is no, the parade, it's fully stopped. Don't know why it stopped, but it's fully stopped. So I tell Tanner, he's the driver now. I pop out of the thing. I think I've got enough time. Where's the nearest restroom? They point me across the street, over behind. So I run across the street, over behind the stands, actually, into this restroom. And you know it, the parade starts to go. And I'm not done going to the bathroom yet. And so finally, I finish and I come out and I can see the float going down already moving down the float route. And I come rushing out and I start chasing it. Well, they were catching up to the fact that they hadn't moved for a while, so the floats weren't going at their normal speed. They were going much faster than they normally go. And the next thing I hear is Ron Simons with his microphone saying, "Richard, Richard, where are you, Richard?" And pretty soon all the stands are saying, "Richard, Richard, where are you, Richard?" And I'm running along behind trying to catch the float, and I'm not a good runner to start with, and I was not making a whole lot of progress. I finally had to get myself one of the little guys on the white scooter, tell him I'm the driver of that float that's moving down there, and they need me in that float. And so I got on the back of a white scooter, and the guy sped ahead to get me up, to catch up, to let me get into the float. And I had to get in front of the float so that Simons could see me, so that he could tell Channer to stop the float long enough for me to get in. And of course, in doing that, it wasn't just like you climb in the back of a car. You know, Tanner had to move because the only place he could move to was to the right, and the only other way I could get in was to go either over the top of him to the empty seat, or he had to move in order to get me back in the driver's seat. It was, in hindsight, it was funny. At the time, it was extremely embarrassing. One of the most embarrassing moments of my life. So, and Simons has never let me forget it. Never.
And you mentioned that Ron had a microphone, so part of his character, he talked to the crowd or something? Oh,
yes. Yeah, Ron, you put a microphone in Ron's hand, it didn't make any difference who the audience was, he was talking to them. I mean, he did that, wasn't on the floats, he did that all his life. I mean, that was who Ron was. He was gifted in that way.
That's pretty cool, able to talk with the audience like, "Hey guys, how you doing?" or something like that.
Oh, in this particular case, he had the audience cheering, "Where is Richard? Where is Richard?" Or more, "Where are you, Richard? Where are you, Richard?" Stands on both sides were hollering, "Where are you, Richard? Where are you, Richard?" Like I say, embarrassing. Especially riding on the back of the white scooter, "Here comes Richard, here comes Richard."
Yeah, but in hindsight, it's funny looking back.
Hindsight, yeah. That's 60 years ago. I can laugh at it now.
So you and the people you worked with on those floats are still pretty close. You guys still hang out every once in a while, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Particularly, Bob Pettis and I are very close. And I see Ron Simons frequently, Jake Jacobson, or Bill Jacobson. I can't ever remember whether Bill wants to be Bill or Bill wants to be Jake, but he's always been Jake to me, so he's Jake Jacobson. We've all been pretty close through the years.
One final question. What advice would you give to current and future rose floaters?
Well, that's a tough question. First of all, it's a tough question because, one, times have changed since when I was there. But building the float working on the float was probably the highlight of my college university career. I made friends that have been friends forever. In addition to that, as I noted earlier, when I needed help from the university, from Henry House, he managed to get my draft notice voided. Otherwise, I'd have gone in the Army. As it turned out, by getting my draft notice voided, I was able to get into the Navy, which was in that era, meant a Vietnam tour. Being in the Navy was a lot safer than being in the Army in that Vietnam era. I learned a lot. I learned a lot of things that in many ways I've never had to use since then. But the other side of the coin is when I saw things that were welded, I recognized good welding. When I saw things that were electrical, I recognized good electrical. When I saw artistic concepts displayed, I recognized the good and the bad in the artist functions. It's an all-empowering experience working on that float.
Thank you, Richard.